I never imagined I'd be here. I grew up in a small town, dreaming of a simple, joyful life. I married Adam, my college sweetheart, when we were young and brimming with hope. We had little, but we had each other, and that was everything. I believed that was the case. In hindsight, the signs of what lay ahead are clear. I never saw it coming. When Jason and I first moved into our small rented house, I met Mr. Harris, our landlord. It wasn't grand, but it was home. It had a warm charm, a lovely garden, and a small backyard I cherished. Jason and I were thrilled to embrace this new chapter together. Mr. Harris was in his early 60s. His face radiated warmth, a smile greeting us every time. He was the landlord who cared, checking in now and then to ensure the house was all right. The first time he came to fix the broken fence is etched in my memory. He was incredibly polite, checking if we needed anything and sharing how much the neighborhood had transformed over the years. I barely gave it a second thought then. He was a kind, older man. Yet, change began to unfold. Adam's job kept him away more often, leaving me alone at home. During this time, I saw Mr. Harris in a new way. He would drop by unexpectedly, checking on the house or simply to talk. I believed it was innocent at first. He was our landlord, after all. Over time, I sensed a change in our conversations. One afternoon, while I tended to the garden, Mr. Harris appeared. He came over often, and while I enjoyed his company, his visits started to feel unsettling. His kindness was undeniable, yet an unsettling intensity lingered in his gaze. That afternoon, he lingered longer than ever. We discussed the weather, the garden, and then life itself. In those moments, I felt a new kind of interest in his demeanor. "Do you feel joy here?" he asked me that day, his gaze making me feel vulnerable. I felt lost in my response. I was happy with Adam, yet a distance grew between us, intensified by his long hours at work. Sometimes I felt isolated, even with him nearby. I couldn't bring myself to say that to Mr. Harris, not aloud. I smiled and nodded, but Mr. Harris wouldn't let it rest. He said it's easy to forget the importance of having someone to talk to, someone who truly listens. His words sent a shiver down my spine. His words hung in the air, echoing even after he was gone. I dismissed it, convincing myself it was merely a casual chat. As Mr. Harris visited more often, I began to see subtle changes in his behavior. His compliments, once light, now felt heavy and unfamiliar. He praised my appearance, my self-care, and my home upkeep. I initially saw his kindness, but soon realized he noticed what others overlooked. One evening, Jason was gone on a business trip. On a quiet night, curled up with a book, the doorbell rang. I was caught off guard and paused before responding. As I opened the door, Mr. Harris smiled at me. He mentioned he was nearby and wanted to check in, to ensure all was well. I smiled and stepped back, allowing him to enter. His unannounced visits had become routine, so I barely noticed anymore. He entered the living room, and our familiar conversation began. This time, an unsettling tension hung in the air. His gaze unsettled me deeply. A single look, a lingering gaze, and my heart raced. Mr. Harris leaned in closer than ever during our conversation. The distance between us vanished, his presence heavy in the air. I recall an awkward laugh, masking the discomfort tightening in my chest. I convinced myself he was simply being friendly, that I was overreacting. Mr. Harris leaned in, sensing my discomfort, and placed his hand gently on the couch's arm. "It's uncommon to find someone like you," he said. "A true listener. A genuine heart." The words appeared harmless, yet his tone sent chills down my spine. I wanted to leave, to express my discomfort, but I stayed silent. I laughed nervously, pulling my legs to my chest, seeking any distance between us, even if only physical. Mr. Harris saw my posture change, and for a moment, we were silent. He gazed at me, his eyes gentle, yet a piercing intensity lingered beneath the surface. "I never wanted to make you uncomfortable," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are truly appreciated. Claire, you are truly special." His voice, whispering my name, stole my breath away. My heart raced, leaving me speechless. I wanted to speak, to shatter the silence, but the words escaped me. I felt trapped, frozen in that moment. Before I could speak, Mr. Harris rose. "I should let you enjoy your evening," he said, smiling once more. There was an oddity in the smile, an unsettling feeling I couldn't identify. "I'm here to see if you're all right." I nodded, throat dry, as he walked away. As the door clicked shut, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I stared at the door, lost in time, struggling to understand what had just occurred. I was torn like never before. I wanted to confide in Adam, but shame held me back, fear of his judgment silencing my truth. I never intended to create issues. I feared causing him doubt or, even worse, anger. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. I couldn't dismiss how Mr. Harris made me feel. It felt wrong, and I refused to support it. I couldn't ignore the sense that his visits held deeper secrets. What was I meant to do? Mr. Harris's visits grew more frequent with each passing day. Every visit from him brought a wave of discomfort and unease. I attempted to dismiss it, but it was increasingly difficult to overlook. He stirred something in me, quickening my pulse, leaving me puzzled. I understood the need for caution. I couldn't allow chaos to take over. Yet I felt a shift within me. I had no idea how profound it would become. Weeks passed, and the tension with Mr. Harris intensified. I still hadn't shared the unsettling encounters with our landlord with Adam. I feared he wouldn't understand, or worse, that he'd become angry and upset. I was only trying to be friendly, right? It was only small talk, wasn't it? I repeated that to myself every time Mr. Harris arrived uninvited, attempting to dismiss my rising discomfort. The unease had become impossible to overlook. Mr. Harris's gaze lingered on me, his fingers brushing the couch's armrest, seeking a connection that felt deeper than mere neighborly ties. I replayed that moment endlessly, each time feeling the tension rise within me. On a quiet Tuesday evening, I stood alone in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. Cooking used to bring me joy, but tonight it felt like a burden. I was distracted, sensing that something was imminent. The doorbell rang just as I began to season the chicken. My heart raced. I glanced out the kitchen window and saw Mr. Harris at the door, his familiar warm smile greeting me. Days passed without seeing him, and instead of relief, a tight knot twisted in my stomach. I dried my hands, inhaled deeply, and stepped toward the door. "Good evening, Claire," Mr. Harris greeted as I opened it. "I hope I'm not in the way." "No, not at all," I said, masking my true feelings with a smile. I stepped aside, and he walked in effortlessly, as if it were the most natural thing to do. He looked around, his gaze landing momentarily on the kitchen where I was making dinner. "It smells amazing," he said, his eyes fixed on the meal I was preparing. I nodded politely, unsure how to reply to your compliment about my cooking. "Just a simple dinner, nothing special." Mr. Harris chuckled. "You always say that, but you make the simplest things feel extraordinary." The compliment was nice, but it felt different from him. It was different from the praise I'd received from friends, or even Adam. His gaze held a heaviness, as if he saw something in me beyond the food or the house. Unease crept in once more, but I fought to dismiss it. "Thanks," I replied, dismissing it. "Is there anything you need? Are you here to find out something?" Mr. Harris's expression changed subtly. He paused before answering. "I need a moment of your time to talk. It's been too long since we truly connected." I was taken aback. We always greeted each other, but we never shared a deep conversation. I knew he was around often, but I never expected him to seek a deeper conversation. Anxiety surged, yet I nodded. "Absolutely, let's sit down." I guided him to the living room and motioned for him to sit on the couch. I sat in my usual chair, facing him as Jason and I often did while watching TV. Mr. Harris broke the silence, his tone grave and unfamiliar. He started off slowly. "I've been reflecting on life lately and how everything evolves. We often forget what truly matters in the chaos of everyday life." I felt lost in his direction. "I understand," I replied carefully. "Life gets hectic, making it tough to focus on what truly matters." Mr. Harris nodded, his gaze piercing through me. Absolutely. Remember to pause and ensure you're truly living, not just existing. His words unsettled me, leaving me speechless. I was lost in his words, unsure if I even wanted to uncover the truth. Claire, he whispered, leaning in just a bit. From the moment we met, I felt an undeniable connection with you, one that I can't shake off. I've lost count of how often I reflect on our talks and your presence. Your strength is inspiring, and my admiration for you runs deep. My breath hitched. His kind words carried the weight of a confession. His words quickened my heart, but not with joy. Suddenly, I felt confined, lost in my response. I scrambled for words, desperate to ease the heavy tension filling the room. I don't know what to say, I murmured, my voice a faint whisper. Thank you for the kind words, Mr. Harris, but I'm happily married. I deeply love my husband. He appeared unaffected by what I said. He leaned back, studying me, his expression a mystery. I understand, he said softly, his tone laced with regret. I don't want to make you uneasy, Claire, but I can't ignore my feelings any longer. His words shocked me to my core. He had admired me before, but this time felt profound. His gaze held a deeper, more intense truth. Fear and confusion washed over me. This was no longer a friendly landlord checking in. It had transformed into something unfamiliar, something I didn't know how to face. I don't want to create issues between you and your husband, but I can't ignore my feelings for you any longer. I needed to share my feelings with you. I was speechless. I tried to speak, but silence swallowed my voice. I never meant to hurt him, yet I couldn't allow false hope to linger. What was I meant to do here? How can I make him see that I'm married and not looking for anything beyond my relationship with Adam? At last, I inhaled deeply, my heart racing wildly. Mr. Harris, I said firmly, I appreciate your honesty, but I must be direct with you. I am devoted to my husband. Thank you for your kindness, but I prefer to keep our relationship strictly professional. A long pause revealed the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He gazed at his hands, then nodded slowly. I understand, he said softly. I regret if I caused you discomfort. It was never my goal. I nodded, relief flooding through me. The tension faded, yet an unsettling feeling remained. Deep down, I knew everything had changed. Mr. Harris's feelings lingered, undeniable and haunting, regardless of my acknowledgement. I stood up after him. Thank you for listening, he said, his voice soft yet tinged with sadness. Enjoy your evening. I respect your boundaries, Claire. I needed you to understand my feelings. I smiled, masking the turmoil within. Thank you, Mr. Harris. Catch you later. I watched him leave, the silence swallowing the space he once filled. A storm of thoughts consumed me. I was in shock over what just occurred. I was married to Adam, yet I found myself in this conversation with our landlord. Why did it feel like my world was falling apart? I shook my head, fighting the doubts that crept in. I needed to concentrate on my life with Adam, to hold on to the love and commitment we once had. A persistent feeling inside whispered that this was just the beginning. I attempted to erase the entire situation from my mind after speaking with Mr. Harris. I feared it would strain my bond with Jason and complicate matters with our landlord even more. I buried my feelings, but they lingered on. Guilt and confusion weighed heavily, leaving me in a cycle of doubt about our interaction. Mr. Harris appeared unexpectedly once more a few days later. The doorbell rang, and my heart clenched. I dreaded the awkward conversation, yet I knew I had to confront it directly. I opened the door, fighting to stay calm. Hi, Claire. He greeted me, his voice a gentle warmth, yet cautious. Just checking in to see if everything's okay with the house. I nodded, a smile strained on my lips. All is well, Mr. Harris. Thank you for reaching out. He paused, uncertainty lingering in the air. I've reflected deeply on my last words. I never intended to make you feel uneasy. I see your limits, and I honor them. I needed to express what was in my heart. I stared at him, the weight of his words heavy in the air. I needed to stand my ground. Uncertainty had no place here. I appreciate your understanding, but I must be clear. I'm committed. I am dedicated to my marriage with Adam, and I won't let anything distract me. I appreciate our professional connection, but it stops there. Mr. Harris's expression softened, yet a trace of sadness lingered in his eyes. He nodded, quietly accepting my words. I understand, he said softly. I apologize for crossing a line. A deep breath brought relief. It's all right. I want to ensure we're aligned. He nodded slightly, then walked away. I stood in the doorway, watching him leave, overwhelmed by a swirl of emotions. It was bittersweet. Sadness lingered, yet relief surged as I finally established the boundaries I needed. That evening, Jason and I shared dinner, and for the first time in ages, I felt completely alive. The past weeks burdened me, yet I knew I had to press on. I focused on what truly mattered: my family, my commitment to Adam, and our love. Is everything all right? Jason noticed my unusual silence and asked about it. I smiled, forcing away the haunting thoughts. Just reflecting. Having you home feels right. He smiled, gripping my hand tightly. Home feels right. In that moment, I saw through the chaos of emotions. My priority stood out. Undeniable. I needed to safeguard my bond with Adam. I refused to let anything stand in our way. Together, we would overcome it all.